Welcome to Take Control of Your Career. If you are looking to level up in your career, then you are in the right place. Today, we are joined by Jennifer Petriglieri, author of Couples That Work, and she is also Associate Professor of Organizational Behavior at INSEAD in France, one of the top universities globally.
Hi, Lauren. Nice to be with you.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. I'm really excited for this conversation, Jennifer. I read your book when it first came out and I loved it. It has so many gems, and we're going to give you a sneak peek into that today. So for anyone listening, if you're part of a dual career couple, I really urge you to check out this book. So I just putting it all out there in full disclosure, I highly recommend it for everybody. So let's get right into it. Jennifer, you talk about 3 transitions that dual career couples go through. Walk us through those, please.
Yeah, so when I started looking at my research, and my research looks at a real diversity of couples, so different career stages, different life stages, real diverse couples, same sex, different sex, all the rest of it. And on the surface, hugely diverse. But what I found was the challenges they faced were really quite predictable. And they fell into 3 really predictable time periods, or these transitions. So the first transition is a transition that all couples face within the first 5-ish years of their relationship. So whether they get together at 25, 45, 65, it doesn't matter, we're all facing this. And it's really the first time we have to take a tough decision, and a tough decision that means we can't keep living parallel lives. So if we think about the early days of our relationship, that lovely honeymoon period, it's wonderful, right? We have our careers, our friends, our family, our hobbies, and we just layered this wonderful relationship on top. What's not to like? And the reason it goes so smoothly those days is we really still live in parallel tracks, even if we feel very close. And then, of course, one day we face a tough decision, which means we need to combine those tracks. So maybe one of us gets offered a job on the other side of the country, or maybe even the other side of the world, right? That's a really tough decision. What do we do? Does someone follow and move their career as well? Do we commute? Do we go our separate ways? Do we stay put? Maybe it's we have our first child. Anyone with children knows that's the end of parallel living, right? We need to make some tough decisions. And this is a really difficult transition because it's deceptive. We tend to look at this first transition point and think practicalities. So maybe we think about finances, right? Okay, you've got offered this great job. If I can move my job to something kind of similar with a similar amount of money, it makes sense. We should do it. And this sounds really rational, but of course, it's never really about that. It's really a question of power and priorities. Who has the power to decide and call the shots in a couple? Whose career is seen as priority? And the biggest mistake couples make in these transitions is to ignore those underlying dynamics. And I think the couples who do really well are the ones that can sort of preemptively take a look at those and start talking about what does this mean for us really in our couple. And those who don't, they tend to store up that regret and resentment that can pop up a few years later. So that's the first transition. It's really about our first tough decision that combines our lives and our careers. The second transition is not linked to your couple stage, first 5 years. It's linked to your career stage. And it's really at that mid-career point that I'm certainly at, and I imagine you are as well, Lauren, right? It falls somewhere in our 40s where we start to really take a step back and think, what do I really want? It's a time of reinvention and transitions. And on the one hand, this is a really exciting time. It's also very stressful in couples, right? If your partner is saying, well, I'm not sure about my career anymore. I'm not sure about where we are in life. I'm not sure about where we live. It's really threatening to our sense of self, to our relationship. And it's no coincidence that this is a peak time for divorces. We see it's a really tumultuous time. And it's a time when the way we support each other needs to shift. So if we think of the early days of our relationship, we really have this model of a good relationship of being a little bit like tea and sympathy. You're wonderful. I'm going to plump up your self-esteem and make you feel great. Now, we all appreciate that. But it turns out it's actually really not helpful in a time of transition, because what that does is it keeps us in our comfort zone, right? And then we sort of stay stuck. So the couples who work well through this transition are couples who really shift their model of support to a little bit more of a loving push, right? A little bit more of a sparring partner. Well, what do you really want? If you're questioning it, where should this go to? And so this is the kind of key of the second transition. And then the third transition comes a little bit later in our careers and lives when our roles are changing. So hopefully when we're younger and mid-career, we're racing up the career ladder, we're kind of that high potential person. But of course, that doesn't last forever. At some point, our careers start to plateau. Now, that doesn't mean we have not got any time in our careers left. We may still have a lot to give, but that fast acceleration is over. Likewise, if we've had children or maybe we've caretaken our parents, those roles may be coming to an end. Unfortunately, our parents pass away at some point and our children fly the nest. Maybe that's fortunately, I'm not sure. And of course, this is a time where suddenly we regain some freedom. But we have a different set of options. So it's a time of where we really question this, okay, who am I? And we start to think about legacy. We start to look at a different shape of our career. And it's a very generative time for couples who can grasp those opportunities and think about that next step of their career. So that's sort of in a nutshell, the three transitions.
Great. Okay. And we're going to dig in to the first two transitions in more detail, because I think that's where most of our listeners are going to be in the thick of it right now. So you laid a great foundation of, that first transition being about how do we make this work? And the second transition being about what do I really want? And it's almost kind of the stereotypical midlife crisis. Almost.
Absolutely, which is a good thing.
Everyone, it's okay, it's normal. And so then we're going to talk about how do we have some tools to successfully make it through. So let's dig in a little bit more on the traps that you talk about in that first transition of, people kind of taking the obvious answer, like I'm going to focus more on the financial answer, or maybe I'll take time off because daycare is expensive once you get a couple kids, and then the ultimate result is you have a couple examples in your book around how difficult it is to get back on the career ladder. So a short-term financial decision actually ends up having a bigger long-term financial impact. So maybe go into a little bit more detail on that, and some suggestions for how to overcome that, given some of the structures that you've seen.
Yeah. So first of all, I mean, we know this is very well known from decision-making science. We have a real bias towards short-term thinking and short-term decisions. But the problem is in careers, I mean, very well, Lauren, what makes sense in the short term very often doesn't make sense in the long term, right? So again, these financial decisions, it looks like, okay, you're earning 2,000 more than me, therefore your career takes priority. Well, who knows, that's going to, pan out over time. And that's not really a sensible way to make career decisions. So a lot of these traps are we see what's in front of us. And of course, that's not a criticism. We have busy lives. It's stressful. It's very easy to do that. But the problem is when we do that, we forget about the bigger pieces of life. So if you sit down with people and say, if you were to make a list of the 10 things that are really most important to you, that maybe in 5 years' time, you'd look back on and say, if I'd have had a shot at that, it would have been good, like life would have been worthwhile. I'm sure there are a couple of financial goals in there for people, but I bet at least 8 or 9 of them are not, okay? And so, but many of those 8 or 9 other ones, it's easy to lose sight of when we're faced with that decision on the table. And many, many couples do this. And so part of it is letting sight of the big picture. And part of it is not talking about things which are a little bit difficult to talk about. So things like whose career takes priority. This is something that's really necessary that couples kind of put on the table and work through and negotiate and agree. And what I found very clearly in my research was that couples who had these conversations, regardless of what they chose, did really well. So it almost didn't matter what career prioritization they picked. What matters was that they actually picked it, right? They didn't just fall into it. They didn't make a decision based on something else, which meant they had maybe one person in the primary career position constantly and one person in the secondary career. So what we see is this making decisions and doing things with intent makes a huge difference to how easily couples can kind of fit their lives together and make it work.
Yeah, and one of the other examples of the career models is where, both careers in a couple take priority. And so you have equal priority, but then the question is, okay, what are the parameters under which, both careers can be successful, so that you have kind of guardrails, like relocation is on the table, but only to these areas, or relocation is not on the table, or, so maybe talk about some of those kinds of couples contracting, if you will.
Yeah. So when we look at the most popular form of career prioritization now, it is this double primary form. But as you say, we need some boundaries, we need some guardrails. Otherwise, things very quickly unravel. And so one of the tools that's in the book is a tool called couple contracting, which is really just a way of talking through a set series of areas to help you make these decisions. So, for example, the absolute foundation is, what do we really want? What makes a good life for us? What makes a
what are the shared values?
What are the shared values? I mean, we all have different words for this: values, goals, purposes. It doesn't really matter what word you put to it. The reason that's so important is all your decisions should build on those, right? If you have a decision which is not reinforcing those, I guarantee it's going to cause regret later on, right? This is very obvious. Once you have those, for all couples, but especially those who want a double primary career, this idea of boundaries is really important. So one, as you said, is geography. A great way to do that is literally print out a map, take a colored pen each and circle where's in, where's out, right? And those places with both colors circle, that's your boundaries, right? Those are the cities, those are the countries, whatever that they're in. Another really important boundary is travel. Now, of course, now with the pandemic, we may laugh at that, but we'll soon be all back on those airplanes. How much travel is too much travel for both of you? What can be sustained in a couple? That's often something that creates a lot of stress. Time, how much time do we want to dedicate to these different domains? Not just how much time is too much time at work, but how much time do we need special time in our couple every week, every month? How much me time do you need? How do you negotiate those boundaries? And I think another boundary that causes the most friction perhaps in couples is, what's the boundary between our nuclear couple and our wider family? So few couples discuss that boundary, and yet it's one of the biggest causes of friction. So what we see is the couples that negotiate these boundaries and agree them. First, it's easier to make decisions. It takes uncertainty off the table, which obviously takes stress off the table.
And if you do these decisions in advance, then there's not emotion attached to it, where there could be the potential of someone feeling like something's unfair or a decision was made intentionally.
So it just really turns the heat down on the relationship, which is great.
Yeah, absolutely. And so whether you do the double primary, or someone's career takes priority, or maybe you take turns taking priority, the same topics are the ones that you suggest people go through.
Absolutely, because let's take the example of a couple have an opportunity to move, maybe abroad, maybe across country, and one partner decides to accompany the partner who got the job offer. It's very easy, once you're in that position, to feel they're in a real secondary position and the other person's career feels huge compared to yours. And that's when resentment can build in, right? And then maybe we make the assumption, well, we moved for you and therefore your travel takes priority and your time at work takes priority, and I then have to pick up at home. And well, hang on a minute, was that really the deal? Or was the deal just, okay, we're going to move to San Francisco? And so it's really important to pick these things apart, because it's so quick that assumptions can get into our relationships, which really drive a wedge between us.
Yeah, great. Okay, so I love all of everything that you just said, some of the tools you talked about with the couples contracting in advance, really thinking through your career journey or your life map almost, in terms of what do you want to accomplish? What do you want to be able to look back and say, yes, I did that? And then how do you make sure that in advance you're building towards that intentionally? So great place for moving into the second transition now, where we're talking about, how is this all there is, or what do I really want now? So what are some of the symptoms or signs of someone who is entering the second transition?
Yeah, it's a really interesting time because it's often they're not good symptoms, right? We can feel restless, we can feel stuck, we may even feel a little bit down, a little bit depressed.
Mhm.
And at times we can also feel a bit hopeless as if we've got in this rut. And a lot of those feelings are associated to, of course, our career where we are, but they're also associated to the roles we've taken in our couple. So let's imagine the scenario where we've moved across country, someone's in the primary, someone's in the secondary position. And the person in the primary position maybe feels, my goodness, I'm in this primary breadwinner position. I just can't afford to make the transition I want, right? And so there's the feeling of trappedness, which is not just about the career, it's about the kind of deal you have in your partnership.
Right,
And
like the financial, in a lot of ways, it comes down to finances. Like we've built a lifestyle around X number, and I'm not happy doing what I'm doing, but I can't afford to make this change
yeah.
for a
So
family.
part of it is definitely about finances, but also part of it is about more kind of psychological roles. So maybe one of you is more risk taking than the other, right? One of you takes more risky roles. I mean, maybe it's entrepreneurship, but maybe it's just, unusual career moves. And the other person's in the kind of steady and stable position. And oftentimes at mid-career, that steady and stable person feels like, I want a bit of that, But often when we're polarized in roles, it's really hard to take a piece of that back. So I think there's definitely that practical finance element. There's also that kind of organization, who's the carefree one in your couple and who's the one that keeps everything in line? Who's the one who manages
Absolutely.
the emotions and who's the one who's very British and kind of stiff upper lip? And often it's these roles which need to shift as well.
Wow. Yeah, I can see how the resentment can definitely creep in on that kind of situation. So, what do you recommend for people to how they approach this with their partner, and how can the other partner who is receiving this new information, how can they best support?
Yeah, so one way I think about this is to think of it a little bit like pregnancy, right? Which it takes 9 months and it's not good to rush. Okay. And just like that, when we think about one of these transitions, there is kind of a necessary amount of time to work these things through. It's not that you could say, okay, we're going to go away for a weekend and figure it all out and make a decision, because you need to kind of experiment and feel your way into these new. So the first really important thing is not to rush, which can be really hard if you're stuck with these difficult feelings. But it's very important to take some time. And I often think for many couples, we're talking about a year or potentially even 2 to really work through what do we really want, how are we going to make this work, and then actually make whatever transition is required. So I think time's a really important thing. I think secondly is this idea of switching our support. When our partner have all these questions, our natural tendency is to pull them close, right? Oh, I'm feeling anxious, so I'm going to kind of keep you tight in the relationship. And this is when people can start to say, I'm feeling stifled, like I don't have any room to grow. And so what we need to think is like, okay, I need to give them some space to figure this out and trust they will. And so I think this aspect of, can we really trust our partner and act as a sounding board in the way we would to a good friend or a colleague, as opposed to thinking, well, I'm really invested in you doing this, so please don't change it. Can we just kind of unhook ourselves a little bit? And the third thing is it's so important to experiment rather than just pick. I think in our cultures, we have this emphasis on like, can you make quick decisions? And isn't that great if you can? At this kind of transition point, it's the worst thing you can possibly do, right? Because, making a drastic career change or even a career orientation without experimenting on, okay, is this really what I want? Or does it just seem great? Can I talk to some people? Can I test it out? It's really important.
Yeah, can you give some examples of how you encourage people to test some things out? Because if you're talking about doing a pretty significant career change, that requires a lot of thought before you actually go and do it.
Yeah. So even if we walk away from the idea of a radical one, even if we're talking about sort of a career reorientation, the minimum is talking to people in that new area. What's it like, really getting to grips with what's it like on a day-to-day? What are the kind of things you do? Really getting an insider's view is the kind of minimum. There's all sorts of books, there's blogs. I mean, depending on what you choose, there's lots of information out there, but are you really taking the time to get it? And then I think for some people nowadays, if we think of the gig economy, all this sort of thing, it is often possible to do a side piece of work in a new domain just to test. So for example, let's take your area, coaching. We know that a lot of people transition to coaching by doing a little bit on the side, maybe doing a qualification, doing a little bit of coaching, getting a flavor of it before they transition across. And of course, they often make the best coaches, right? Because they've done it mindfully. And I think we can think of that in other areas. Is there a little pro bono project, a way you can donate a bit of time just to really get your feet wet before you dive straight in?
Yeah, great suggestion there, not to rush the process and make too many permanent changes too quickly. Let's talk a little bit more about clarity as well, because this "what do I really want" question, I think comes up to a lot of women and men that, I'm talking to a lot of people right now where I don't know whether maybe there's an added layer coming out of COVID where it's really challenged us to reflect over the last year about what's really important to us. What's your thought about what you're seeing right now with people experiencing this moment?
I think COVID in some way, for a researcher anyway, is fascinating. And in some ways, I don't think COVID has changed anything. But what I think is it's revealed what was already there. It's amplified existing dynamics. So I think in normal times, if we go back 2 years, we could have been just about getting along, right? Just about fine. And we're in a track, so we just carry on. And what COVID revealed for some of us is actually, poof, I'm not sure I like that track. And we're very clear about that, but we may not have clarity on what's next.
Exactly.
And I think another mistake is feeling like I have to be 110% sure before I make a jump. That's probably never going to happen. You will never make a jump. And I think this idea of what do I really want? Of course, it's always an ongoing question, because the answer you have at 45 will be different at 55 and at 65. And that's okay. That's normal, right? That's developmentally okay. So I think it's about, instead of thinking about the answer, thinking about a provisional answer, which is good enough for me and us in the couple for where we are now. I think, and you see this often with younger people. So back in the day, I used to teach the MBA students, they're sort of mid to late 20s, and they almost have this Disney idea of the perfect job, just like the perfect Prince Charming, job charming, and I'm going to find it and I'm going to live happily ever after. And of course, from our position, we can sit back and laugh, but we still very often do that, right? Especially when we're in this transition. It's like, okay, I've got to figure out the absolute perfect solution. It's probably not out there, but what we're looking for, something that's just better aligned with what we want. And I think that question of, rather than being 100% clear, thinking more about being closer aligned to my values, what's important to me, is probably more helpful. And it's probably going to land us in a place that we feel more meaningful and with less regret afterwards.
Right. I used to have a mentor that said that it's not always about making the right decision, but about making the decision right.
Absolutely.
And so can you feel like you went through the right due diligence? And one of the things that I've always thought is that, I make the best decision based on the information I have today. And there are very few decisions that are permanent. And so you can always make a different decision at a later point. And, there might be consequences and it might, be challenging, but it doesn't mean that you can't change direction. The other thing that you said that, really struck a chord with me is, how people have kind of gone on this career progression and then, they ask, like, is this really what I want now? I think there's so many people, especially like you were talking about in their 20s, where they just get on a career track because it's where they got their first job, or, it sounded good at the time, and then you're good at it. And so you get promotions and you get job offers, and then you keep on climbing the ladder. But sometimes you look around at this stage and say, wow, I don't know how I really got here because I didn't choose this. I just was going along with everything that was offered to me. So again, it comes back to that intentionality.
It is about that intentionality. And I think, honestly, in our 20s and 30s, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Often our initial career choice is kind of suggested to us, maybe by our parents or our peers or the university we go to or the college we're at. And it's well intentioned, right? You know, I don't think any of these people forcefully push us down a path.
Right.
And at the time, it probably maybe was a good path to start on.
Absolutely.
But there are very few people, especially nowadays, especially now we have longer careers and the tendency is to move around. There are very few people who the career path they picked at 20 is still going to suit them at 40, even if they've gone up that ladder, right? Our passions change, and that's very normal, and it's a good thing.
Great perspective. The one last thing I want to touch on in our conversation is this concept of zero-sum partnerships versus growing the pie, or a positive sum mindset. So tell a little bit more about that, and give us some tools to how to think about how we think about our relationships and how we give and take.
Yeah, so if we think about the way, especially working couples are portrayed in the press, in the magazines and the stories we read, it's very much zero-sum game, right? You negotiate as if you're negotiating with a car salesman or something. And if you gain, I lose a bit, right? So if you get to go ahead in your career, I get to lose in mine. Now, the problem with this narrative, A, it's not true. It doesn't have to be that way. And B, is it sets you up for conflict. Right? If there's always a loser when there's a winner, this is not going to work well in relationships. And we can see this in the very well-meaning narrative of sacrifice, right? You know, or compromise, right? You do this for me, and then I'll do that for you. It may work with a used car salesman. It's not very good in a relationship. Mm-hmm. A much better way of looking at it is, rather than thinking about your career and my career, or your choice and my choice, is to think of it as, okay, this is our life. There are a set of decisions we have. How might they benefit us holistically? And what might be the downsides? And how do we make sure over time the decisions we take get a good balance for us as a whole, as a couple, and also as a family? So let's take the example that one of you gets a big promotion, but it means you're going to have to work really hard, right? That's very often one which can feel like a winner-loser position. Well, hang on a minute, I'm going to have to pick up blah, 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 all the slack, which is one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is, okay, it's a great opportunity for you. What might it give to us? Right? What opportunities might it provide to us as a whole? Well, we'll have more money, so maybe we can get more help at home, right? Which is going to benefit us both. Or maybe it has the opportunity to take us to a different city, which we've both been looking for adventure, right? And what we find is when couples just reframe, and instead of thinking about you versus me, think of the positives and negatives for both of us combined, because there's never a decision which is all good for one and all bad for the other. But that's just often how we present it, because that person who got offered the big promotion might also be thinking, actually, I'm not sure I want to be away 5 nights a week to not tuck the kids in, right? So there's negatives there as well. But it's like, can you get all that on the table and think about the pie expanding, as opposed to you have a bigger slice and I have a smaller slice?
I love it. Thank you for giving us that framework. That is so powerful, and one that I hope people will take to heart in terms of how they look at some of these decisions going forward. So again, the book is Couples That Work. And by the way, it is so readable. It's full of great stories, actionable takeaways. As I was reading it personally, I was thinking, I've been through that, we've had that conversation. We need to actually think about this, in my own personal relationship. And for the record, that we have one where we are a dual priority. We're both entrepreneurs, both business owners. So for us, it's one of those things where we have to figure out, how do we make it work for our family? So I was able to relate to everything that you were talking about. Jennifer, where can people find the book?
So any bookseller, they can find it. I'll show you there's the book, so you know what the cover looks like. You can also, if you go onto my website, jpetriglieri.com, maybe you can put a note after the show.
Absolutely.
I have a free survival series, a video series with worksheets. You can just download. It's all for free if you want some little tidbits for later.
Absolutely. You also have a TED Talk, so we'll post all of that on the show notes as well. So
Great.
thank you so much for joining
Thanks
us.
so much
Really
for having
loved
me,
the
Lauren.
conversation.
Thank you.